Have you ever wondered what it really means when a man reaches his 40s and still lives alone, without a girlfriend or partner? Is he lonely? Or simply free? Is society judging him unfairly, or is there something deeper going on beneath the surface? Could this be a conscious choice, or the result of invisible forces shaping his life over the years? Welcome to Deep Thought Realm, where we don't just accept the obvious. We dig deeper, question the norm, and explore the unseen layers of human experience. Today's episode will take you on a journey through psychology, social pressure, and hidden truths that many never dare to speak out loud. Ready to dive in? From childhood, boys are handed an invisible blueprint. It's not written down, but it's everywhere. Echoed in movies, schoolyards, family dinners, and locker rooms. It says, grow up, get a good job, find a nice girl, settle down, become a provider. It's subtle at first, but as the years go by, the pressure intensifies. Society doesn't just expect men to build a life, it expects them to build it a certain way. And that way usually includes a relationship, a long-term one, preferably leading to marriage, maybe kids. So when a man reaches 40 and he's not in a relationship, eyebrows are raised. It's rarely said directly, but the implication is there. Something must be wrong. People begin to speculate. Is he emotionally unavailable, afraid of commitment, socially off, secretly miserable? The questions swirl, not out of curiosity, but from a place of quiet judgment. But here's the problem. We rarely ask why he's single from his own perspective. We don't stop to wonder if this was a conscious decision or if life simply unfolded differently for him. We don't ask whether he's thriving on his own terms. Because in the traditional framework, there's very little room for deviation. If a man doesn't follow the script, the system assumes he failed, not that he opted out. This script is rigid and outdated. We live in a world that's evolving fast. Relationships are no longer a one-size-fits-all situation. Some people want love, but not marriage. Others want connection, but not cohabitation. And then there are those who want space to grow alone. But society hasn't caught up with these nuances. Instead, it clings to the old blueprint, making men who deviate feel like outliers even when they're just living in alignment with their truth. So maybe the better question isn't what's wrong with him, but rather, what's wrong with the system that assumes every man needs to follow the same path? At Deep Thought Realm, we're not here to judge or assume. We're here to look beyond the surface. And what we often find is that solitude, especially in midlife, can be a sign of self-awareness, not lack. There's a dangerous stereotype lurking beneath the surface of our culture, one that equates being single with being flawed, especially for men past a certain age. The common assumption is that if a man is still alone in his 40s, there must be something off about him. Maybe he's emotionally unavailable, or maybe he's just socially inept. But this assumption is not only shallow, it's wrong. And more importantly, it blinds us to a more nuanced reality. Many men who live alone in midlife are not lonely misfits. They are highly intelligent, emotionally aware, and deeply intentional about how they live. They've walked through relationships, careers, failures, and transformations. They know what connection feels like, and they also know the cost of maintaining it when it's not aligned. These are not men who've never loved. Often they are men who have loved deeply and stepped away, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Let's not forget, growth brings discernment, and with discernment comes higher standards, not just for others, but for oneself. A man who's been through life knows what drains him, what inspires him, and what's worth his emotional bandwidth. He doesn't chase for the sake of chasing. He doesn't enter relationships to avoid being alone. He values his peace and he guards it with purpose. What we're seeing in many of these men is not failure, it's self-mastery. They're not avoiding intimacy, they're refining it. They may have chosen solitude not because they lack options, but because they've learned that not all company is nourishing. In a world that constantly tells us to pair up, choosing to stand alone by design is a radical act of self-awareness. At Deep Thought Realm, we believe it's time to stop diagnosing independence as a defect. The truth is, many of these men are living lives of depth, clarity, and focus. They're not behind, they're not broken, they're just walking a quieter, less traveled road, one that deserves not pity but respect. When we talk about men in midlife, biology is often reduced to one single narrative: the dreaded decline. Lower testosterone, slower metabolism, thinning hair. But that's just the surface story, an outdated caricature of aging. What we often overlook is that biologically something far more interesting is happening. As testosterone gently steps back, something else steps forward: mental clarity, emotional regulation, and a sharper sense of identity. In youth, testosterone drives risk-taking, competitiveness, sexual impulses, sometimes even chaos. But in midlife, when these biological forces mellow, a different kind of man emerges, one who no longer feels the need to prove himself through conquest, be it financial, romantic, or social. He's more focused, more selective, and more grounded in who he is rather than who the world thinks he should be. This shift often leads to what we might call purposeful independence. It's not born of bitterness or loss, but of refinement. A man in his 40s who lives alone may not be missing anything. He might simply be moving according to a new rhythm, one that prioritizes stability over stimulation, depth over drama, peace over performance. What biology quietly teaches us is that different stages of life activate different strengths. Youth may offer speed and intensity, but midlife offers insight. A man in his 40s often becomes a master of his own internal world. And in that mastery, relationships take on a new meaning. They're no longer about filling a void, they're about alignment. And if alignment isn't there, solitude becomes not just acceptable, but preferable. At Deep Thought Realm, we invite you to look at biology not as a curse, but as a compass. What if the man alone at 45 isn't declining, but transforming? What if he's entering his most evolved, intentional phase yet? One where solitude is no longer something to fix, but something to embrace. Let's be honest. Relationships aren't just romantic ideas wrapped in affection and shared Netflix accounts. They're intense, emotional ecosystems. Behind the Instagram smiles and candlelit dinners lies something much less visible but far more real: emotional labor. And for a man in his 40s, especially one who has already been through a few seasons of love, this labor is no longer romanticized. It's evaluated, measured, sometimes even declined. Every meaningful relationship requires vulnerability, compromise, and emotional availability. That's not weakness, it's the cost of intimacy. But here's the catch: not every man wants or is willing to invest that emotional currency anymore. After years of giving, adjusting, and carrying invisible weight in past relationships, many reach a point where they ask, is it worth it this time? And if the answer isn't a resounding yes, they choose solitude instead. Not because they can't love, but because they won't settle. This isn't a rejection of love. It's a recalibration of priorities. Some men discover that the peace of living alone, making their own decisions, and protecting their mental space is far more fulfilling than navigating another relationship that may or may not align with who they've become. They're not running away from intimacy. They're preserving energy for what truly matters to them. There's also a kind of emotional maturity in recognizing that not every connection deserves lifelong commitment. Some men see relationships not as trophies to acquire, but as energetic exchanges. If the energy is draining, unbalanced, or chaotic, they walk away. Not out of coldness, but from wisdom. Because with age often comes the realization that peace is not negotiable. At Deep Thought Realm, we believe that choosing to be alone isn't always about what's missing, but about what's finally being protected. These men aren't avoiding connection. They're choosing peace with precision. And in a noisy world filled with shallow noise, that kind of clarity is powerful. Here's a question that haunts many when they see a man living alone at 40. But isn't he lonely? It's a fair question, but often the wrong one, because loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. In fact, some of the loneliest people on the planet sleep next to someone every night. Loneliness isn't about who's around you. It's about whether you feel seen, understood, and connected, even in a room full of people. Many men who live alone are not drowning in emptiness, they're thriving in quietude. They wake up in silence, they think without interruption, and they move through their day according to their own rhythm. That silence, for some, is not a void, it's a sanctuary. For them, peace is not the absence of people, it's the absence of emotional chaos. They've learned that being alone doesn't always hurt. Sometimes it heals. Let's flip the script. Imagine a man in a relationship that's unfulfilling, where communication is strained, intimacy feels forced, and emotional connection is lacking. That man may be partnered, but he's deeply alone. On the other hand, another man lives by himself, spends weekends in nature, has meaningful conversations with close friends, reads, reflects, and feels in tune with himself. Who's truly lonely? It's not about the numbers, it's about the depth. Science backs this up. Studies on loneliness consistently reveal that quality of connection matters more than quantity. One deep, authentic relationship can prevent loneliness far more effectively than 100 shallow ones. For many men in their 40s, solitude becomes a time to rebuild that authentic connection with themselves first. And from that inner foundation, the need for constant external validation fades. At Deep Thought Realm, we challenge the assumption that alone equals sad, because sometimes being alone is the bravest and most honest thing a man can choose. In a world that's constantly pushing people into noise and company, choosing silence and being okay in it isn't weakness, it's strength. It's not loneliness, it's alignment. It's not just personal choice that defines how a man's solitude is perceived. It's the cultural lens through which we view him. In some societies, a man over 40 without a partner is met with suspicion, pity, or even ridicule. He's seen as incomplete, immature, or perhaps emotionally defective. But step into another country, another value system, and you'll see the same man regarded with quiet admiration, independent, wise, free. It's not him that changes, it's the mirror he's being reflected in. In traditional cultures, especially those with strong family-centric values, there's a clear timeline: marriage by 30, children by 35, and a life wrapped in routine. Deviation from this timeline is not just discouraged, it's seen as failure. So when a man dares to chart a different course, people talk. Not because they understand him, but because they fear what they don't. His choice becomes a threat to their comfort zone. But in more individualistic or progressive cultures, the narrative shifts. Here, autonomy is celebrated. Emotional independence is seen as a strength. A man who lives alone and pursues his own interests is not lost. He's self-actualized. He's seen as someone who isn't afraid to stand apart from the herd, to listen to his own voice even when the crowd shouts otherwise. In such places, solitude becomes a badge, not a burden. This cultural divide matters because many men internalize the messages they grow up with. If culture tells them that singleness equals failure, they may carry silent shame even if their life feels complete. On the other hand, If culture normalizes diverse paths, they're empowered to explore without guilt. In the end, it's not just about personal desire. It's about what the world around them allows them to feel okay wanting. At Deep Thought Realm, we encourage you to question the framework, not the man. Ask not, why is he alone? But what does his society make him believe about being alone? Because sometimes the discomfort we project onto others isn't about them, it's about us. And freedom starts when we stop expecting everyone to live the same story. Let's be honest, modern life offers a buffet of distractions. But for many men in their 40s, these aren't just time killers, they're anchors. Work isn't always a burden, it's often a mission. Hobbies aren't just weekend escapes, they're deep, meaningful pursuits. And technology, for some, it's not a trap but a portal to creativity, learning, and global connection. In this landscape, solitude doesn't feel empty, it feels full. Many men today are redefining success, not by relationships or titles, but by the depth of their passions. A man might spend hours designing a piece of digital art, restoring a vintage motorcycle, diving into astrophysics, or planning his next solo backpacking trip. These aren't distractions from love. They are expressions of it. Love for life, for discovery, for self-development. And in this devotion, romantic partnership may simply not be the priority anymore. There's also a deeper shift at play. In earlier decades, men were often raised to believe their identity hinged on partnership, on providing, on being half of a whole. But today, many realize that they can be whole on their own. And once that realization settles in, they often redirect their emotional energy into things that truly resonate with their soul, not societal timelines. That doesn't mean they're anti-relationship. It just means they're no longer willing to pause their passions for people who might not align with them. They've tasted the richness of self-direction, and they're not quick to give it up for the sake of tradition. In a way, their work, their hobbies, their quiet rituals, they become companions. And for many, those relationships are more stable and enriching than the fleeting ones they've left behind. At Deep Thought Realm, we invite you to view passion as more than a pastime. For some men, it becomes a purpose, a spiritual path, a reason to wake up with fire in the heart. And in a world constantly pushing people toward coupling, a man who chooses creation over convention is not lost. He might just be more alive than ever. Not every man who lives alone does so out of comfort or curiosity. Sometimes the silence isn't a preference, it's a scar. Because behind many solitary lives lies a hidden story of heartbreak, betrayal, emotional manipulation, or years spent trying to fix something that was never meant to be whole. These aren't bitter men, they're bruised, and their solitude isn't rejection of love, it's self-preservation. Let's talk about trauma, the kind that doesn't show up in medical records but echoes in the silence between relationships. A divorce that shattered their sense of trust, a toxic partner who weaponized vulnerability, years of emotional labor that left them drained and disoriented. When a man gives deeply and loses everything, rebuilding doesn't always mean returning to love. Sometimes it means stepping away from it altogether, for a while or forever. These men are often misunderstood. People say, he's cold now, he doesn't open up anymore. But what they don't see is what it cost him the last time he did. For some, solitude becomes a shelter, a place where they can control the variables, manage their triggers, and finally breathe without the fear of emotional collapse. It's not that they can't love, it's that they've loved too hard and now they move with caution. And here's the truth. Healing doesn't always look like moving on. Sometimes it looks like pausing, retreating, rebuilding inner foundations that were once shaken. And while the world may see these men as distant or detached, What they're really doing is guarding their peace. Not because they hate connection, but because they now recognize its price. At Deep Thought Realm, we honor the invisible stories. Because behind every lonely man label might be a soul that once gave everything and is still learning how to give to himself. Not all silence is emptiness. Sometimes it's a soft and necessary act of survival, and sometimes it's the only way back to wholeness. Something fascinating happens to certain men in their 40s. While the world expects them to settle down, they quietly begin to wake up, not into routine, but into reinvention. It's as if a second life opens up, one beyond youthful ambitions, beyond old expectations. They quit their jobs, they sell their houses, they move to new cities, sometimes even new continents. And in that bold leap into the unknown, they often choose to do it alone. For these men, solitude isn't the end of something. It's the beginning. A clean slate, an open space where they can finally listen to the questions that were too quiet to hear during the chaos of earlier life. Who am I when no one's watching? What do I believe? What kind of life do I truly want to live now, not just maintain? These aren't midlife crises, they're midlife awakenings. It's not uncommon for men in this phase to dive into spirituality, philosophy, art, or nature. They begin meditating, traveling solo, journaling, or studying things they always loved but never had time for. These aren't hobbies, they're lifelines. Each new experience reconnects them with a version of themselves they had long forgotten or never dared to explore. And in that rediscovery, relationships often take a back seat, not out of rejection, but out of realignment. Relationships might come later, or they might not. But what drives these men isn't fear of love. It's the pull of self-discovery. They've come to realize that before they can share a life with someone else, they need to fully live their own. And sometimes that means walking alone into uncharted territory, following only the sound of their own inner compass. At Deep Thought Realm, we believe transformation doesn't always happen in pairs. Sometimes the greatest revolutions are solitary, when a man reclaims his life, not to escape connection, but to redefine what it means. He doesn't become less, he becomes limitless. And in that quiet expansion, something extraordinary begins. We often assume that people end up alone because something didn't work out. Timing, luck, love, whatever. But what if that's not the case? What if for some men solitude isn't an accident, but a conscious, radical act of choice? What if they looked at everything society told them they were supposed to want and simply said no? These men aren't avoiding love. They're not hiding from commitment. They're fully aware of what relationships offer, and also of what they demand. And in that awareness, they've made a bold decision to choose themselves, their time, their energy, their emotional clarity. This is not isolation born from rejection. This is sovereignty, living on their own terms, not out of bitterness, but out of inner alignment. To many, this looks confusing because we've been conditioned to believe that happiness equals togetherness, that a life without romance must be a life without warmth. But these men challenge that idea. They create rich, vibrant inner worlds. They cultivate deep friendships. They mentor, build, write, teach, travel, create. Their days are not empty. They're full of intention. And here's the paradox. When a man truly embraces his solitude, he often becomes more emotionally available, not less. Why? Because he's no longer driven by need. He no longer seeks someone to complete him. He's already complete. Any future connection isn't to fix a wound, but to share a vision. That's not desperation, that's discipline. At Deep Thought Realm, we honor that kind of choice. the kind that breaks from the expected path and says, I am enough, as I am. In a world that constantly equates value with attachment, these men remind us that solitude, when chosen with awareness, is not a failure to connect. It's a commitment to live deeply, honestly, and freely. Maybe the man who lives alone at 40 isn't incomplete, but uncompromised. He's not avoiding life. He's living it on his terms. No noise, no pressure, just presence. In a world that demands conformity, choosing solitude is an act of quiet rebellion and deep wisdom. At Deep Thought Realm, we believe every story deserves to be heard, especially the ones that don't follow the script. If this episode made you pause, reflect, or feel something real, drop a comment below. Let's open the conversation, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive. You're not just watching a video, you're joining a realm where thought runs deeper than expectation.